The Christian Life Bible College was founded over 30 years ago, and it has trained men and women in the Word of God over a long period of time now. The courses which we run cover a wide range of subjects, and in terms of duration, they can last from 10 weeks up to several years. We do modular courses, of which this archaeology course is one. But in addition to that, we do bachelors of divinity and also Master of Theology courses in the near future. And so we have a long history of exploring the Word of God, encouraging people and bringing them to a closer experience of Jesus Christ. Now, something about the lecture series, Archaeology and the Bible, or rather, something about the lecturer. The Reverend Dennis Peterson has been interested in archaeology since the early 1950s, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. He is an Anglican clergyman and for 33 years pastored a church in what he calls a back street of Brixton. In fact, it was during the time when the Brixton riots took place, and his testimony and witness and evidence is included in Lord Scarman's report. So he is a man who's lived through real situations which have been hard and had emergencies within them. And Dennis speaks from experience within his life. Dennis, before that, had hoped to train to become a marine engineer. In fact, it was as a young man, he said that his interest in ships was born. As a child, he says that whereas his friends knew all the names of the members of the Arsenal Football Club, he knew all the names of the tugs of the River Thames. But it was during the time of training that upon him there came a deep conviction that the only just, worthy and proper place for him to go in eternity was hell. And he cried out to God. As a consequence of that, he became a Christian. Later on, in the early 1950s, he was in a lecture when the lecturer advised him to go to the British Museum, and all the other students as well, to touch the stones, Sennacherib stones, which were burned by Nebuchadnezzar, and to listen, as it were, to the sounds of the people screaming as they died in the fires. Dennis says, I think I was the only person who went, but when I did as I was told, and I was hooked. In this course of lectures, you will see the results of Dennis's being hooked in an interest in archaeology. What is he aiming to do? He is aiming to show that archaeology supports the claims, the historicity, and the validity of the Bible. And what does the Bible do? It does what Dennis found when he heard a verse of Scripture, that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. The Bible reveals Jesus. I hope you enjoy this series of lectures.
This beautiful photograph taken halfway between the Earth and the Moon, our lovely little planet, very strangely, this particular shot focuses on the Holy Land, on the Middle East, on the Holy Land, on Mesopotamia and Egypt. And it was there that the ancient civilizations rose and fought against each other and fell into the dust, there to be dug up and recovered, and are now in the dust of the museums for us to dig out. Looking back through history, we go back to Henry VIII, to William the Conqueror. It's a bit of a shock to realise that the 1,000 years from the New Testament to William the Conqueror, just the same as the 1,000 years from William the Conqueror to us. But going back, there's Nelson, Henry VIII, William the Conqueror, and back over to the New Testament. But beyond the New Testament, there were lots of doubts. The only information we had was the Bible and a Greek historian, Herodotus. Because the Bible was full of religious elements, there was a question mark about the Bible. There came, for the first 1,500 years of the Christian era, nobody doubted the Bible. It didn't occur to people to doubt the Bible. It was gospel truth. But then, after the Reformation and the Enlightenment, people first of all began to look at the Greek legends and epics. And they didn't really think that the goddess Athene, with her flashing eyes, upset the warriors outside the walls of Troy. It was all myths. And the problem of reading and writing is very difficult. And the ancients, of course, weren't very intelligent. In fact, Voltaire, time of the French Revolution, in an essay on the Old Testament, he said, we must remember that the people in the days of the Old Testament, the people's minds were very crude. Reading and writing, very difficult, and with the ancients being not very intelligent, they knew the Greeks could read and write, so science decided that reading and writing must have evolved about the 8th, 9th century BC. In fact, one scholar said that we've got the stories of Elijah, but Elijah the prophet didn't write anything down. And we've got Amos, and he wrote things down. So probably writing evolved between the times of Elijah and Amos. Wow, David can't be true. Moses, Abraham, must be a lot of myths and folk stories told round the campfire. Can't rely on it at all. They decided to look at the Bible just like any other book. And they decided that the Bible was just a collection of old folk stories and myths. This attitude was reinforced by the French Revolution. The French Revolution abolished the church, they abolished the king, they abolished they abolished God. And France was going to lead the world into a new era, liberty, equality, fraternity. And if you don't agree, we'll chop your head off. The French were jealous of the British possessions, empire, and they decided that the new France must have an empire. They knew that the Indian people weren't very happy with the British rule, and they thought they could quite easily persuade the Indian people to switch allegiance to France. And so Napoleon embarked with an army to go to Egypt. They had control of the Mediterranean, so they're all right getting across the Mediterranean, but not having control of any other seas, Napoleon and his lads would have to walk most of the way from Egypt down through to India. Knowing the reputation of the interesting things in Egypt, Napoleon took with him a party of 167 scholars, artists, civil engineers to study the antiquities of Egypt as they went through. Nelson had different ideas, and Nelson came along, and at the Battle of the Nile he destroyed the French fleet. Napoleon was cut off from France. British diplomats fed him with stories of disasters in France and also stories of what Josephine was up to. And so one night Napoleon left his army and embarked in a small boat and nipped back to France, leaving his army to fall into the hands of the British. They were defeated by the British and by disease, and all the material the scholars had collected fell into the hands of the British. The British Museum, until this time, was a very small affair. About 1753, a man called Hans Sloanes left the king a large collection of antiquities on condition that they should be available to the public. The king said he couldn't afford to do it, so passed it on to Parliament. Parliament said they couldn't afford to do it, but they would grant £100,000 for this project if the money was raised by a lottery. They had the lottery, the money was raised, and a house was purchased, and the museum was started. But to visit the museum, you had to apply in writing, and only 5 people were allowed in at a time. However, after the defeat of the French army in Egypt, a big British warship anchored in the Thames and began to unload the most amazing statues. And these were brought to the British Museum, and the museum was extended to house the statues, and the museum really began to take off. But on these statues was strange picture writing. Nobody could read it, and it was realized that if only this picture writing could be understood, these ancient statues would almost literally start to speak. And so it became the great puzzle of the age to unravel this picture writing. The first real breakthrough, came through a British physicist named Young, who first suggested that light came in waves. And he got to work. Amongst the collection of antiquities, there was a very interesting stone, the Rosetta Stone. Soldiers were preparing a fort to resist the British at Rosetta, the delta of the Nile. One of them came across this stone and reported it to his officer, Lieutenant Bouchard. He called in the scholars, and they were excited. It consisted of 3 panels of writing. The bottom panel was in Greek, which any scholar could read immediately. And it was almost certain that the subject matter of the 3 panels would be exactly the same. So from the Greek, it should be possible to read the other panels and the picture writing. Young, studying the Greek and the picture writing, found a series of half a dozen or so of these sausage-shaped frames, which he called a cartouche, or a bag. And he discovered that in the Greek text, these sausage-shaped frames corresponded with the names of royalty. And he deciphered Ptolemy and Berenice, and that the writing was in a kind of an alphabet. But there it ground to a halt. In France, a young lad, a genius, dedicated his life to deciphering the hieroglyphs at the age of 11. The age of 11, one of Napoleon's scholars showed him some picture writing and said, "Nobody can read this." And young Champollion decided he was going to be the one who would read it. He was quite a genius. The age of 17, having mastered several languages, he read a paper to a learned society at Grenoble showing that the middle panel of the Rosetta Stone was very closely related to the script of the Coptic Church in Egypt. There's an amazing Christian community in Egypt that has survived right through from New Testament times, right through the Islamic period till the present day. And young Champollion had discovered that they had in fact fossilized the ancient Egyptian language, preserved it down through the ages. And he showed from the middle panel of the stone that the Coptic Church had preserved the Egyptian language, and that middle panel was very close to their script and their language. Took him many years, working from the Rosetta Stone and from many other monuments. After 20 years, Champollion at last unravelled the hieroglyphs. And immediately the perspective of history was changed. Instead of going back just 2,000 years to New Testament times, scholars immediately were reading material time of David, 1000 BC, 2000 BC, going back to 3000 BC. And all sorts of things, interesting things, came to light. For instance, they read about labourers building a pyramid going on strike because of the poor quality of their beer and their rations. All kinds of things came to light about everyday life in the ancient world. And instead of writing emerging about the 8th, 9th century BC, it was seen to have gone back nearly 5,000 years. Painted on the side of the stone is a more modern inscription. It says that it was captured by the British Army in Egypt in the 1801, the reign of George III. The stone itself isn't very interesting. It was just a proclamation by priests celebrating the anniversary of the coronation of the Greek king. After Alexander the Great, all the kings of Egypt were Greek, and saying that they would offer sacrifices on his birthday, that sort of thing. Not very interesting material. Older than the hieroglyphs was the script of Mesopotamia. This is an example of what is almost certainly the oldest script in the world. It's called cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped. In Mesopotamia, the ground was very fertile. The Persian Gulf had been silted up by material washed down from the mountains. The farmers had cut the trees down and the soil washed down from the mountains. It became very fertile. And people discovered that with proper irrigation, 2 or 3 bumper crops a year could be provided. Other people wanted to get in on the prosperity, and people from the desert, people from the mountains fought their way into the plain and tried to capture a piece of land. And that meant that people who were there already, the Sumerians, had to gather together into fortified towns. These quickly became well organized, and the center of the town was the temple. And the temple and the priests supervised all the affairs of the town. And the temple became the bank and the center of commerce generally. And the priests had to deal with quite a lot of transactions during the day, and the problem was how to remember them. One of them had a bright idea of getting a piece of clay and drawing a picture on it. This was before the days of the wheel, and the farm cart was in fact a sledge. So the priest would draw a picture of a sledge on the clay. 3 dots meant 3 loads, and he'd draw a picture of a stalk of barley. That meant 3 cartloads of barley were owed to the temple. 5% a year. This was about 3,100 BC. 5% a year. It's a lot of barley you owe the temple. Perhaps we'll take a check instead. Doing 20 or 30 of these before his coffee break, the priest had to work harder and harder, and the pictures became less like pictures and more just like quick stabs in the clay. And the stalk of barley, and this is actually what happened, became 3 marks like that. You'll see exactly like the cuneiform on this carving that we were looking at. And the wedge-shaped characters, cuneiform means wedge-shaped, the wedge-shaped characters were exactly the same whether they were written on parchment, clay, stone, wherever they were used, exactly the same as if they were on clay. One problem was that other people had to understand the jabs in the clay. And very quickly, dictionaries came into use, and these dictionaries have been discovered, proved absolutely invaluable in deciphering the texts. There was very little about Israel in the hieroglyphs. There was a little, but not much. But as people started to read the cuneiform, they found themselves reading about this troublesome little backwater place in the Middle East that was always causing trouble, Israel. To begin with, it was thought that the marks were just a kind of decoration, but it became clear that it was in fact a script. There was a very interesting, well-known inscription involving a potential Rosetta Stone for cuneiform, an inscription 400 feet up a cliff called Behistun, which means the place of the gods. A young lad called Rawlinson, a brilliant linguist, an army officer, was seconded to the Persian army to help reorganize the Persian army, and he took an interest in this inscription. He made a copy of it. Took him, on his days off, bank holidays and so on, it took him 10 years to copy the inscription. There were 3 panels. It was assumed that one panel almost certainly would be in the old Persian language. The other panels they just didn't know. Rawlinson, during his 10 years copying, knew that he mustn't make any mistakes. Every detail had to be correct. And so, on ladders, lowering himself down from the top of the cliff, 400 feet above the ground with the birds whizzing round, he made an exact copy of the 3 panels. A team of 5 or 6 scholars got to work on the script. It was extremely difficult. The old Persian was deciphered. Someone discovered a sequence of words which they deduced was so-and-so the king of kings. And from that they got the Persian word Shah for king. And gradually they built and built using script here and other scripts. And eventually it was announced that cuneiform had been deciphered. There were so many problems that it was doubted. And so a test was arranged, and a cuneiform cylinder or prism, actually made about 1000 BC, time of David, copies of that were given to each of the scholars, and they had to decipher it and submit their results in secret to Royal Asiatic Society. And the day came when all the submissions were opened, and it was found that all the submissions agreed in detail. And so it was accepted that cuneiform had been deciphered. The cuneiform has given us many insights into the Bible. And as we open our Bibles, we come to the story of creation. It's common to ridicule the story of creation, comparing it with modern science. If the writer of the story of creation was going to be true to science, he would have had to keep changing the text to conform with the latest ideas on science. Not so long ago, matter could neither be created nor destroyed. A little bit later, matter was continuously being created. And now from the recession of the galaxies, we know that creation, in fact, actually took place 12 billion years ago. The real measure of the Bible is not the latest fashion in science, but the kind of stories that were around when the creation story in the Bible was written. Here is a story of creation according to the Babylonians, and it's against this kind of story that the Bible account must be compared. Let me tell you the story of creation. If you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. The gods were fed up with the noise that Tiamat was making. She was creating havoc everywhere. You can't blame her. Tiamat was the goddess of chaos. She was only doing her job, but the rest of the gods, it was too much for them. And several of them tried to crush Tiamat. By the way, she was the saltwater ocean. And Tiamat, she just couldn't be beaten. One day, the god of Babylon, Marduk, sometimes known as Bel, which is connected with Baal, Marduk said, if you will make me the chief god, I'll deal with Tiamat. So Marduk got his army together and went off to fight Tiamat. Here is a cylinder seal which shows a picture of Marduk fighting the dragon, the goddess Tiamat. She opened her mouth to swallow Marduk, but he blew her up with the west wind, made her into a great big balloon, and he chopped the balloon in half, made one half the sky and the other half the earth. And that's why Babylon is the most important city in the world. Compare that story with Genesis, and as you read the beautiful, cool account in Genesis, you can feel the Holy Spirit breathing through. You didn't believe that rubbish about Marduk and Babylon, did you? Don't take any notice of that. It wasn't Marduk of Babylon. It was Ninurta of Nineveh. He was the one who blew Tiamat up and made her into a ball, and that's why Nineveh is the most important city in the world. Those Babylonians getting too big for their boots. Every city adopted the myth to its own political ends. There's no comparison between the Bible account of creation and the myths at the time, but one very interesting comparison is with the flood. That's a different matter altogether. The flood story was discovered by a young man called Smith. Smith, working class boy, was apprenticed as a banknote engraver, very interested in the Bible, very interested in what he was reading in the papers about Rawlinson's discoveries and cuneiform and the tablets that were being read. And he would spend all his lunchtime in the British Museum. He asked so many questions. Rawlinson got to know him, and Rawlinson took him on to help him. And Smith became an expert at deciphering the cuneiform and also fitting together broken fragments of the clay tablets. One day, Smith astounded the rest of the office by throwing off his coat, ripping off his tie, taking off his shirt, dancing round and round the office. When they calmed him down, they found that he had been reading an ancient Babylonian account of the flood. Unfortunately, the tablet was only a part of the story. The Daily Telegraph offered gave him 1,000 guineas to go off to Babylon and find the rest of the story. He went, and he did find it. Unfortunately, he caught fever and died at Aleppo. The story of the flood, the Babylonian story of the flood, is part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that was very popular for 1,000 or more years in the ancient world. It was the story of the king of Uruk, the Erech that we read about in the Bible, and he was a tyrannical king, compelled his servants to build, his citizens to build enormous walls to the city. Those walls have been excavated and found that the story wasn't exaggerating, and all sorts of oppression till his citizens cried to the gods to deliver them from the tyranny of their king. The gods sent along a wild man from the forest called Enkidu. Enkidu and Gilgamesh had a wrestling match. Gilgamesh won, but the two became fast friends. They then went round the world having all kinds of adventures until one day Enkidu caught a fever and he died. Gilgamesh was confronted with the fact that the paths of glory lead but to the grave, and Gilgamesh decided to search for eternal life. He found his way to the river of death, and he bribed the ferryman to row him across the river of death into the underworld. And there he met a man called Utnapishtim, who was the only mortal to receive eternal life. He asked Utnapishtim how this came about, and Utnapishtim told him, "If you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. The gods were fed up with the noise that the human race was making. They couldn't sleep. It's terrible if you can't sleep. They decided that the human race must be abolished. They were going to send a flood and destroy the whole human race. But Ea, one of the gods, had a favourite, Utnapishtim, and she whispered through the reed walls of his house and told him that he must build a boat, bring his family into the boat, and the seed of every living thing into the boat. He did this, the rains came, the flood, and the boat lifted off. Like the Bible, Utnapishtim sent out 3 birds, different birds, different order. The first was a dove, which came back. Second bird, I think, was a swallow, I'm not sure, that came back. The third one was a raven, and that didn't return. So he knew that the floods had gone down far enough for the raven to settle. The ark, or his boat, settled. He disembarked and offered up a sacrifice to the gods, and the epic tells us how the gods smelt the savour of the sacrifice and flocked to the sacrifice. And that's very close to Genesis, which says that God smelt the savour of Noah's sacrifice. So the Bible story, very close to the Babylonian myth. There were many accounts of the flood with different characters. Atrahasis was another ancient Noah. Far more interesting, the ark seems to have been discovered today. In the 1914-18 war, Russian flyers over the mountains of eastern Turkey reported seeing a boat-shaped figure in the mountains. Not much notice was taken of it, and then after the Second World War, pilots reported seeing this shape in the mountains, and people went out to try and find it, but it seems that often it's covered with snow. But in the early 1990s, an American marine salvage expert, David Fazold, went to investigate it and took with him all sorts of scientific equipment. Unfortunately, he was too anxious to get to the job to get his paperwork cleared up. And after doing some amazing work on this find, the Turks turfed him out. But he was able to go back again under the auspices of a Turkish archaeologist, and they did find what are almost certainly the remains of the ark. With his equipment, he found that under the ground there were bulkheads. They found great flat stones with a hole through, which would have been used for steering the boat, and anchors. All sorts of things were found. The photographs in his book are amazing, and I'm convinced that the actual ark has in fact been discovered. Let's go now to Ur of the Chaldees. When Abraham left it, it was an ancient city. It was a city which had perhaps 150 or 200,000 inhabitants at its peak. And here, the map of the city, there are 2 docks and great temple area. Woolley excavated about 1,000 graves in Ur, 17 of them were particularly interesting. They're rich grave goods, and one of them he called the Great Death Pit. In the Great Death Pit he found over 60 bodies, and many of them were ladies of the court. Here is a crushed skull with a gold headdress, just as Willie found it, and here the headdress has been restored. One of the ladies was found with her headdress rolled up in her pocket. It seems that the people gathered together in the pit with the king, the body of the king, the dead king, in a little house at the bottom of the pit, and they had music and probably drank a narcotic. A little drinking vessel was found by each corpse and a big bowl in the middle, and whilst the music was being played, they drifted off into the next life, and earth was poured in, trampled down, various ceremonies. This one lady had her headdress in her pocket, and it seems that she was late for her own funeral. Perhaps she didn't want to attend her own funeral. She might have been saying goodbye to her boyfriend, but she didn't have time to put her headdress on. All sorts of interesting things were found. This is called the Royal Game of Ur, and the way my little brain works, looking at it, it suggested to me the game of hopscotch. We know that many things have come down to us from the ancient Sumerians. They were the first ones to divide the circle into 360 degrees. They divided the hour into 60 minutes. Their mina weight was the same as the English pound weight. They had double entry bookkeeping. They invented the wheel. They invented the potter's wheel. They invented the arch and the vault. Amazing civilization with many things that have come down to us. Now we know that Roman children played hopscotch on the stones of Rome, and I wonder if the children at Ur played hopscotch. Certainly this game is laid out exactly like a hopscotch pitch, and I wonder if Abraham as a young lad played hopscotch with his school friends. Don't know exactly how the game was played, but it seems to have been something like Ludo, and if you landed your piece on somebody else's piece, they were sent off. These finds were made about the time that the wheel had been invented, and Willie discovered this sledge. The wooden parts are modern, but the metal parts are ancient Sumerian. And Willie thought that perhaps just as today the Queen doesn't go to the opening of Parliament in the latest Rolls Royce, she goes in an ancient, venerated carriage. So the kings of Ur went in this royal sledge, which was associated with the good old days of Ur. This is dated 800 to 1,000 years before Abraham, and shows what an artistic ability and tradition there was in Ur of the Chaldees. Willie found several of these harps, and he found different animals on heading the sounding boxes: a bull, a cow, a goat, a sheep, and so on. And the bull had one which was obviously of a much lower register, and he wondered whether they had four-part harmony, but unfortunately no cuneiform sheet music has come down to us. But several of these harps were found, and it would be wonderful to know exactly what music they played. Willie was particularly interested in this object that he called the Royal Standard of Ur. It took him 3 weeks to dig it out. He didn't want to disturb it at all, so he covered it with muslin and then molten paraffin wax and delicately, during 3 weeks, he managed to get it out without disturbing any of the ivory pieces set in pitch. It shows the city of Ur going to war, and there's a lovely comic strip picture of a chariot going into battle at the bottom. The left-hand picture, the chariot moving along quite sedately, and then the succeeding pictures goes into battle. The next one, the donkeys are sniffing the smell of the blood and the shouts of the battle, stepping over a fallen enemy. And the next one, even more animated. And in the last one, the donkeys are galloping along. In the chariot, there was a javelin thrower and the charioteer. And a school in Essex made a replica of one of these chariots. Their biggest problem was with the donkeys, but they managed to get some control, and they found that although the wheels didn't steer at all, the short wheelbase made the chariot very manoeuvrable. In the centre register, the infantry are going into battle, and they only had spears. Metal was so scarce, there wasn't enough to make a sword, just a precious piece of this marvellous stuff called metal stuck on the end of a pole. And infantry going into action, they've captured some of the enemy, and in the middle, a fallen enemy is being stripped. They wore leather armour and leather helmets. At the top, the king got down from his chariot, and he's reviewing the prisoners. Here is probably a cause of the conflict, a boundary stone. In the Bible, we read quite a lot about boundary stones, what a dreadful thing it is to move your neighbour's boundary stone. This is a boundary stone and covered with very interesting details about the land, how it was inherited and who it belonged to, and all the attributes of the land, how special it is. Probably somebody one day came back to Ur with the news that the neighbouring city had moved the boundary stones, and so Ur went out to recover the lost territory. The other side of the standard shows Ur celebrating the victory. At the bottom register, the grocer is delivering all his goodies. The middle register, the butcher's arrived with animals to be slaughtered for the feast, which is taking place at the top. Unfortunately, the king in the top left-hand corner was lost in antiquity, but the next royal figure seated on the throne was the crown prince. And there they are celebrating the victory. The cabaret has just been brought on, and in the top right-hand corner, one of the harps that we saw earlier is there being played, and a soprano clasping her hands across her bosom as she hits the high notes with the latest pop song. Some scholars thought that this was the sounding box of an instrument, but a relief has been discovered with a very similar object carried on a pole, just as Woolley thought, and I think that Woolley was probably right, that this had some ceremonial significance, and when the court was in procession, perhaps to the temple, this was carried in front of the king. This dagger with its golden sheath is very interesting. Each of the panels in the sheath are different treatments of the same motif, showing quite a deep attitude to art, quite a thoughtful attitude to art. The gold is arranged to represent a plaited sheath, and the whole object filled with artistic interest. Woolley found this very interesting mound, and he studied it at great length. It's the remains of the ziggurat at Ur, the temple mound at Ur. The people had come down into the plain from the mountains and thought their gods were happier on the mountains. And here's one artist's impression of the ziggurat. It had 3 main staircases, and the centre one went right to the top. There were different platforms. The bottom platform was a black glazed brick. The next platform was of red glazed brick. The top platform was of blue glazed brick, and on the top was a silver shrine. Around the platform, each platform, were gardens, and the arrangement Willie found an arrangement for watering the gardens and draining them. The walls were very subtly curved to give an impression of size. The ziggurat, very clearly a kind of the Tower of Babel, and Herodotus, the historian, tells us that at the ziggurat at Babylon, a priestess went into the shrine at the top of the ziggurat and spent the night there, and the gods would reveal to her things that she must tell the king. Seems to me that it was a spiritualist kind of religion, and part of the reason for the disapproval of the Lord to the Tower of Babel. In the story of the Tower of Babel, in Genesis, it says about let us go to and build us a tower whose top will reach unto heaven. Now, in the Authorized Version, the words "may reach" have been supplied. They're not there in the original. And Woolley found inscribed on the ziggurat at Ur that it was the temple whose top is heaven. And instead of being a temple like you see in the picture books of the Tower of Babel, like Jack's Beanstalk going higher and higher until it went through the clouds, don't think it was like that at all. The idea was not to reach the heaven above the clouds, but to reach what St. Paul called the heavenlies, the spiritual realm. And that spiritualist practice, I'm sure, was at the heart of that religion. This very modern-looking brickwork is, in fact, from the top platform, the blue-glazed brick of the ziggurat at Ur. It used to be freestanding in the museum, and nobody took any notice of it. I'm sure they thought it was a storage heater. It looked so modern. This was a later restoration by Nabonidus, so I doubt whether Abraham would have actually seen this brickwork, but certainly Abraham would have been very familiar with the older form of the ziggurat. In the suburbs of Ur, Willie found the remains of a temple, a place called Al-Ubaid, and it had been violently destroyed in antiquity, and the remains buried and preserved. He found this enormous copper relief that was over the doorway of the temple, and it showed the good God spreading out her wings and bringing rain, and the bad gods, the antelopes that came down from the hills and gobbled up all the crops. And a very interesting frieze here showing a milking scene. The cows are being milked and on the right, and butter is being churned on the left. And the theology was that the goddess gave the milk of life to her worshippers. Very interesting to us is the foundation tablet of this temple. Very important to the Sumerians and the Babylonians who followed them were king lists. When a king died, he became a god, and you had to worship him. It would be terrible if you missed one out. Just imagine an important king and you forgot all about him, and there he was amongst the gods. He could make trouble for you. So it was very important to remember all the kings. And so king lists were made. And these king lists covered hundreds of years. The scholars thought that the early kings on the king list were absolutely impossible. They had enormous reigns. Some reigned for over 100,000 years. And the scholars thought they must be mythical. But the foundation tablet of the Temple of Ur shook everybody, for it mentioned one of the kings who was one of the first on the Sumerian king list, Mes-Anipada, the son of Anipada. And here was an early king on what was thought to be a mythical king list, found to be, in fact, an historical personage. One scholar, Bowerman, has suggested that the length of reigns of the kings was multiplied as a mark of respect. We know that even in the New Testament, the genealogy of the Lord Jesus was artificially arranged. The Matthew genealogy was artificially arranged to give us symmetry. And there was no deceit about it, because anybody could check it by reading the Old Testament. And the genealogy was in fact a kind of heraldic mark of respect. And probably the reason for the vast reigns that the kings lived was that if they were a good king, their reign was multiplied by 10, and especially good, the length of his reign multiplied by 100. Around the time of Abraham, there was a very powerful king called Hammurabi. We don't know quite how he came to the throne. All sorts of legends. One says that he was found floating in a basket in the river as a baby, found floating in a basket in the river. But Hammurabi became king of Akkad, which almost certainly was either very close to Babylon or was Babylon itself. And Hammurabi built a great empire. Hammurabi lived about 1800 BC, which is roughly the time of Abraham. He conquered the whole region, and unfortunately he destroyed the city of Mari. The excavations at that city have shown that it was an extremely advanced culture at Mari, but very little remains because of Hammurabi. But having conquered most of the cities of the area, he did us one service by gathering together the laws and customs of the region. And in the city squares, he set up pillars with the laws upon them. The customs and practices of Hammurabi's laws throw a lot of light on the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons. Now, all the early stories of Genesis were centered in Ur of the Chaldees. That was too much for the scholars. They knew that the Israelites had been, or the tribe of Judah, had been taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, and they thought that whilst they were in Babylon, the Jews picked up the old stories, creation, the flood, and so on, and wove them into the stories of Genesis. But the story of Genesis was quite unacceptable as a historical document containing any truth. But the practices recorded by Hammurabi verify the accounts of the patriarchs. The way that Abraham and Sarah treated their servants, the way that Hagar was turfed out when she made fun of Sarah, the way that they behaved in everyday life, found to conform with the practices of the time, as on this stela of Hammurabi and other documents. those practices in fact changed, and by the time of the kings and by the time of Nebuchadnezzar had been completely forgotten. So if the stories of the patriarchs were fictitious, they must have been written by geniuses who were able to reconstruct ways of life that had totally disappeared by the time that these later people were supposed to have written them. Also, the form of the stories of the patriarchs weren't known at that time. They just didn't write stories like that in those days. They are quite, that kind of historical narrative is quite a late invention. And so there's every reason to believe that the stories of the patriarchs are accurately set in the period in which they are said to have been written. This clay tablet is a record of Hammurabi, one of the accounts of Hammurabi's genealogy. All kinds of interesting things about everyday life in the ancient world have been revealed by these clay tablets, and this is a mathematical treatise, or not exactly a treatise, but a set of problems that were written out by a schoolmaster for his scholars. And it's a very complicated set of problems about digging a ditch, defensive ditch round a city, calculating the amount of earth that was to be removed, and so on and so on. But a very complicated set of arithmetical problems. The next one fascinates me. It's a geometrical treatise giving the way to find areas of different shaped figures. It's not from it is from Babylon, but its interest to me is that it's dated just about the time of Abraham. And so instead of Abraham being an illiterate nomad with a few goats, he might well have sat by Isaac, helping him with his A-level homework. The culture was very advanced in mathematics, and they could find square roots, which I can just about do. Also, they could find cube roots, which is way beyond me.